代理主席。
Thank you, Mr. Deputy. According to the latest statistics, the total mainland and non-mainland visitor arrivals last year decreased by 2.5%, 2.9% and 1.2% respectively as compared with those of the year before. And the decrease in the second half of last year was higher than that in the first half. The business income of tourism-related industries, including retail, catering, and hotel industries, as well as tourist attractions, has dropped significantly. Some members of the industries envisage that there is little sign of optimism this year. The Chief Executive, Mr. Ray Chen, I ask for a quorum count.
Yiu Si-wing 議員。
Mr. Yiu Si-wing.
等等，仲爭一個。
Please wait. We are one short. Please be seated.
Yiu Si-wing 議員。
Mr. Yiu Si-wing. The Chief Executive has stated in the 2016 policy address that to move our tourism industry up the value chain, the government will highlight the unique and diversified experiences Hong Kong offers and showcase our gourmet culture. It will also promote cultural and creative tourism, organize mega events, and draw more conventions and exhibitions to Hong Kong. However, the tourism promotion projects put forward in a paper submitted by the authorities to the panel on economic development of this council are all ongoing projects, except the theme-based exhibition area featuring local comic characters to be set up at the Golden Bohemia Square, Lumiere Hong Kong to be funded by the Mega Events Fund, the big station due to open soon in the Central and Western District, and the FIA Formula E Championship to be held in October, which are new ones. The tourism industry are therefore of the view that these projects would be of little help in enhancing the market competitiveness of the tourism industry. Quite a number of members of the tourism industry have relayed to me their hope that to allay their concern, the government should give a clear account of the specific details of the various promotion projects and programs which will be launched this year. In this connection, will the government inform this council? 1. Whether it has formulated short, medium, and long-term targets and measures to move the tourism industry up the value chain? If it has, of the details. If not, the reasons for that. 2. Apart from the aforesaid promotion projects, of the details of tourism promotion projects and programs which will be launched by the government this year, including whether there are specific outcome indicators, if there are no indicators, of the reasons for that, and 3. Given that tourism-related industries are facing hardship amid a business downturn, whether the authorities have plans to allocate more resources to help those industries and the practitioners concerned to tide over the difficult times. If they do, of the details. If not, the reasons for that. Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development. Mr. Deputy, my consolidated reply to the three parts of the question raised by Mr. Yiu Si-wing is as follows. The tourism industry is a pillar industry of Hong Kong. It accounts for about 5% of our gross domestic product and provides about 270,000 jobs at different levels, making significant contributions to Hong Kong's economy and employment. The government has attached great importance and been giving strong support and substantial resources to the development of the tourism industry. After rapid growth over the past decade, the tourism industry has entered a consolidation period. In view of the change in the mix and spending patterns of visitors to Hong Kong, coupled with the competition posed by neighboring travel destinations, we need to review the development strategy of the industry. As the Chief Executive emphasized in policy address this year, the tourism industry should not merely focus on the growth in tourist numbers, but should move towards diversified and high value-added services. Our goal is to strive for more diversified visitor source markets and attract more high-spending overnight visitors to Hong Kong. In the light of the challenges currently faced by the tourism and retail sectors, the government allocated additional resources last year. An additional funding of $80 million was allocated to the Hong Kong Tourism Board, TB, for stepping up overseas promotion efforts. Another $10 million was allocated for setting up a one-off matching fund to encourage local tourist attractions to launch distinctive tourism products in collaboration with hotels, travel agencies, retail merchants, etc., with a view to drawing more high-spending overnight visitors to Hong Kong. The government will continue to pursue short, medium, and long-term measures to cope with the changing circumstances, with a view to reinforcing our strength and injecting new momentum into the tourism industry. One key area of our work this year is to reinvent Hong Kong's tourism image. We've asked the TB to change the focus of promotional efforts from shopping to Hong Kong's diversified travel experience, including our gourmet culture. The TB is formulating a new promotion strategy on Hong Kong's tourism image. We hope to highlight Hong Kong's gourmet culture in future promotion efforts, such as the appeal of Hong Kong's gourmet through international media and inviting Hong Kong chefs to perform at overseas promotion activities of the TB. In addition, we will further develop cultural and creative tourism. Initiatives to be launched this year include the Hong Kong Comic Garden, adjacent to the Golden Bohemia Square, to be opened in May, the Lumiere Hong Kong, to be staged in Hong Kong for the first time in November, and Big Station in the Central District, that is the former Central Police Station compound, to be opened by phases this year. These initiatives showcase a mix of Hong Kong's history, culture, and arts in different ways to give visitors a diversified and new experience. Different spectacular mega events will be held in town to attract more high-spending overnight visitors to Hong Kong. This will bring business opportunities for sectors including tourism, retail, food and beverage, hotels, etc. Of these, a series of sports mega events will take center stage. In addition to the well-received events, including the Hong Kong Sevens, Hong Kong Cyclothon, etc., the FIA Formula E Championship will be held in the new Central Harbourfront for the first time in October as the first stop globally for the 2016-17 season. And this is the Formula E Championship. The TB will also continue to organize more large-scale mega events and strengthen promotion efforts. Furthermore, the Mega Events Fund is currently open to a new round of applications, and we hope that more mega arts, cultural, sports and entertainment events will be held in Hong Kong. Some mega events may be existing ones, but they still play an important role in boosting Hong Kong's tourism industry. Say, for example, the International Chinese New Year's Parade, the Hong Kong Dragon Boat Carnival, and the Hong Kong Wine and Dine Festival have gradually built up a reputation. We should push ahead with existing mega events and encourage the trade to launch related distinctive tourism products. We should also strengthen promotional activities to create a strong ambience of mega events with a view to attracting more visitors and extending their stay here. Meetings, incentive travels, conventions, and exhibitions, MICE, as well as cruise tourism, also draws high value-added visitors here. The TB will continue to strengthen promotion towards MICE event organizers and partners with professional associations and convention organizers so as to attract more MICE events to Hong Kong. Successful events secured include the 55th Orient and Southern Asian Lions Forum, the World Congress of Anesthesiologists 2016, the 26th International Congress of the Transplantation Society, etc. Meanwhile, we'll continue to promote cruise tourism through the TB. The two theme parks of Hong Kong will also continue to take forward their respective development plans. For Hong Kong Disneyland, a new theme area based on Marvel's Iron Man franchise and a new hotel with a theme dedicated to this periods of exploration will be opened in 2016 and 17 respectively. As regards the Ocean Park, the first hotel and an all-weather water park are expected to be completed in 2016 and the second half of 2018. On medium-term development, the West Kowloon Cultural District will be in the spotlight of cultural tourism. Facilities such as the CG Centre and the M+ Museum for Visual Culture will be completed in the coming few years. On long-term development, the government is planning the development of the tourism node of Kai Tak Fantasy and Lantau with a view to developing these new strategic locations into new tourist attractions. The government will also continue the discussion on further development of the Hong Kong Disneyland Resort, including Phase 2 expansion with the Walt Disney Company. I believe Hong Kong is capable of providing visitors with a unique and diversified travel experience. The government will continue close collaboration with the trade, the TB organizations related to the tourism sector, subject to the needs of the industry, allocate more resources as appropriate to support the industry. Mr. Yiu Si-wing.
對旅遊業嘅短期措施講得比較多，但係喺呢個中期發展嘅計劃呢，只有西九文化區，而呢個項目呢，亦係由呢個民政事務局負責嘅，對香港旅遊業嘅持續發展呢，幫助有限。面對未來香港嘅困境同埋外圍嘅競爭，當局係會唔會
Hong Kong is in a plight, and will the government put in place a serious considerations for medium and long-term development, and through consultation with the trade, enhance Hong Kong's competitiveness in the area in terms of tourism industry? In my main reply, I've already said that there is the WKCD and the facilities therein, and on the long run there is the tourism node of Kai Tak Fantasy and also Lantau development. There will be development studies done. In the end of the former runway, there is potential for it to be turned into a standard entertainment and recreation facilities. For Kai Tak Fantasy, there is an area of 300,000 square meters to be turned into various use. Say, for example, entertainment, retail. The Development Bureau at the end of last year has asked companies to express interest so that they will make proposals to the government and give the details of their proposals. And when it comes to development of Lantau, the government has already given details. The Secretary for Development will chair the Lantau Development Committee. They will discuss about proposals to develop Lantau Island. At the moment, there are public engagement exercises. On Lantau, there is a recreation and entertainment, and there is also development strategies for tourism to turn Lantau Island into a diversified attraction. To the north of Lantau and also northeast of Lantau will be more recreation and leisure activities. In South Lantau, there will be some degree of low-density recreation and leisure facilities. So for the medium and long term, there are plans to enrich Hong Kong's tourism industry and tourist attractions and facilities. Mr. Tony Tse. Thank you. I'm happy to hear from the Secretary in his main reply about the various initiatives. One of the key area is to reinvent Hong Kong's tourism industry and to develop a more diversified experience. Of course, if we are to have diversification, we can't just simply rely on eating and shopping. And there are lots of local special characteristics that are very interesting that will leave visitors with a very interesting experience. And in the main reply, it's said that there will be a Hong Kong Comic Garden near the Golden Bohemia Square that will be opened in May. When it comes to showcasing local animation characteristics, there are actually some other events. So how do you tie this in with the other exhibitions to promote them to create synergy? Secretary. I thank the member for the question. When it comes to the Hong Kong Comic Garden, will actually complements various creative and cultural venues in Wan Chai. And in Wan Chai, there is a Hong Kong comic base. And in Wan Chai, there are also a lot of attractions showcasing Hong Kong's unique characteristics that is related to our culture. We have an exhibition area. We have the Hong Kong Comic Garden. This will enrich Hong Kong's tourist experience. Well, there is something different in the Wan Chai Comic Garden because there is an interactive area. Say, for example, you can take selfies with the animation characters, or there is a mahjong table. You can sit there and play with the other characters. So it's a bit different from the Tsim Sha Tsui Star Avenue of Stars, where there are handprints of sculptors and also animation creators. We'll liaise with various industries in the, say, manufacturing industry, the toy industry, and games industry, game designers, so that there will be some crossover. So it's not just about animation. There will be some cross-industry cooperation, so that services in other sectors will also be used in the tourism industry to enlarge the pie. Mr. Ma Tung-kwok, I have a question. Tourism industry is a pillar industry in Hong Kong, but when it comes to tourism, is mainly coordinated by the CEDB and also promoted by the Tourism Board, and there is also the Tourism Industry Council in place. But this arrangement is less than ideal. In the long run, say for example, there is no dedicated department when it comes to planning. So would the government, for the long run, consider setting up a dedicated bureau to be responsible for the tourism industry? We actually have a dedicated department, which is the Hong Kong TB, which is a Tourism Commission. Well, for the various bodies, they have their different functions. Say, for example, when it comes to planning, there is a Tourism Commission. There is also the Tourism Board. When it comes to group tours, whether they are inbound or outbound visitors, it is under the purview of the TIC. And we also have the Tourism Travel Agencies Authority. This is an established practice that has been proved to be effective. We're actually working on setting up the travel agencies commission or authority. When our work is ready, we will come back to the LegCo. Mrs. Regina Ip. Thank you, Mr. President. I have heard a lot of new activities and attractions from Mr. So. However, they are trivial, or they are just some old ideas. I failed to see how they can help to attract more visitors to Hong Kong. The Secretary talked about WKCD facilities, M+. I know that for M+ Museum, it is bigger than about 50%, by about 50% of the entire area of all museums in Hong Kong. But what will they showcase? How is it better than museums overseas or museums showcasing antiquities on the mainland? When it comes to tourism industry development, there are some mega events. Say, for example, Hong Kong Sevens, the Wine and Dine Festival. These are regular events. When they are held every year, they create an atmosphere to boost our appeal. Apart from regular events, we have added some more mega events. Say, for example, starting from last year, there is the Hong Kong Cyclothon. And this year, there will be the Formula E Championship. When it comes to animation and comics. Sorry, speakers off mic. Sorry, speakers on mic. You told me about a cyclothon. What is the use? I was asking something else. Well, just now the member said that these are trivial events. That's why I explained that there are some regular standing events and also new events to give a new experience. Well, when it comes to M+, there is actually a new attraction. Mr. Yu asked about medium, short, and long-term development. That's why I mention it. When it comes to the M+ in the WKCD, well, specific details are under the purview of another policy bureaus. So please allow me to give the information by paper. If Mr. So doesn't know anything about M+, I'd rather him not just read out the information on paper. Mr. Frankie Yick, number of visitors has plummeted. A number of sectors, say for example, retail and also F&B has been affected, which in turn affects logistics and transportation. There is a hard-hit area, which is the coach. Someone told me that the business has dropped by 50%, while operating cost has been increasing. Were it not for the fact that the oil prices stay at a low level, it would be difficult for them to continue to operate. However, the Secretary failed to answer part 3 of Mr. Yu's question. That is, whether the government has any plans to increase resources to help these sectors and their practitioners to tide them over the difficult times. Well, the Secretary... Well, let me give you an example. Can there be a short-term waive of the coach parking fees at the cruise terminal? In my main reply, I mentioned that we're aware that in recent time there's been some challenges faced by the tourism and retail sectors. That's why we enrich the tourist experience by adding more events, mega events, and tourist attractions. We have given an additional funding of $80 million to the Tourism Board to enrich the tourist experience. There is also a matching fund that encourage local tourist attractions to work with hotels to attract more visitors. And there's also something to do with the shopping. No, my question has not been answered. Well, are there any measures to help the sectors and practitioners to tide them over the difficult times? Secretary, I think when it comes to that, we have to focus on the appeal of our tourist attractions. When there are more tourists coming to Hong Kong, and it will help the industry.
Last question seeking an oral reply, Mr. Martin Liao. The Antiquities Advisory Board AAB published in January last year the report on the policy review on conservation of built heritage. AAB recommended in the report that the government should set up a dedicated fund on the conservation of built heritage to provide funding for public education, publicity activities, academic researches, as well as public engagement and consultation programs. In his recently delivered policy address, the Chief Executive indicated that the government would earmark $500 million to implement AAB's recommendation for the establishment of the fund. However, some conservationists have pointed out that the government has not put forward any specific proposals in respect of AAB's recommendations on encouraging private owners to conserve their historic buildings and pursuing the conservation of historic buildings on the premise of respecting private property rights. In this connection, will the government inform this Council, 1, of the details of the work on establishing the aforesaid fund, including the work objectives, the timetable for accomplishing the various objectives, and the performance indicators, whether the authorities will consider making the fund a statutory one. 2, given that as the first step to prepare detailed records of historic buildings, the Antiquities and Monuments Office, AMO, has deployed its work team to conduct 3D scanning for historic buildings which are either under threat or worthy of public viewing, whether AMO has selected the historic buildings according to their assigned grading, how AMO carries out the relevant work when owners of privately owned historic buildings refuse to cooperate with AMO. And 3, given that in recent years, quite a number of privately owned historic buildings have been demolished before they are graded, of the experience which the government has learned from such cases, and whether it has, in the light of such experience, formulated afresh a set of proposals on historic building grading and conservation which respect our heritage while looking forward. Secretary for Development. President, in early 2013, the government invited the Antiquities Advisory Board, AAB, to assist in a policy review on the conservation of privately owned built heritage by making reference to the challenges met and experience gained in the conservation work over the past few years. The AAB completed the review in end 2014 and released the review report in early 2015. We welcomed the AAB's recommendations and subsequently set up task forces to carefully examine them. We announced that we formally accepted the AAB's recommendations in December 2015. My reply to the various parts of Mr. Martin Liao's question is as follows. 1. In the 2016 policy address, the Chief Executive announced that resources would be earmarked to implement the AAB's recommendations, including the setting up of a fund dedicated to the conservation of built heritage administratively. The government will first earmark $500 million for the fund. We will set up within this year a committee comprising primarily non-official members to advise the government on the operation of the fund. The fund will finance two existing initiatives, that is, the Revitalizing Historic Buildings Through Partnership Scheme and the Financial Assistance for Maintenance Scheme for Privately Owned Graded Historic Buildings. For the latter, we will raise the grant ceiling for works projects and expand the scope of the scheme to cover all historic buildings for non-governmental use, such that more comprehensive maintenance works would be carried out. Further, the fund will support public education, community involvement activities, promotional activities, and academic research. Our preliminary thinking is to collaborate with professional institutions and non-government organizations in enhancing community involvement activities and to financially support current programs such as the Friends of Heritage scheme. We will also carry out a pilot study on the point-line plane approach for conservation and work with the AAB experts and stakeholders to explore the way forward on the subject. The AAB was of the view that the fund should be set up in the most effective manner. We consider that a fund of administrative nature can be established and start operating within a relatively short period of time. In the long run, we will not rule out the possibility of evolving towards a statutory fund given its merits. At this stage, setting up an administrative fund would be the first step to implementing the AAB's recommendation. The organization and operation of the fund will be reviewed when appropriate in the light of the experience in running the fund to identify the best way forward in meeting the objectives of the fund. 2. With additional staff, procured equipment and training, the Antiquities and Monuments Office, AMO, will commence 3D scanning for historic buildings within this year. The AMO will determine the targets and the work priority in accordance with the heritage value of the historic buildings and the potential threats posed by development. Initially, 3D scanning will be conducted for declared monuments and the historic buildings scheduled for major restoration works by the AMO. Generally, the AMO would approach the owners of the privately owned historic buildings concerned to secure their consent before commencing on-site recording work. From past experience, these owners seldom refuse the AMO's request for making cartographic records of their historic buildings. In case where the AMO is unable to enter a historic building to make records for any reasons, such as building conditions, it would conduct 3D scanning of the building's external elevations. Detailed records of historic buildings would be compiled in a reasonable and appropriate manner with due respect for private property rights and in the light of the practical environment and circumstances. 3. The current grading system for historic buildings is administrative in nature. It aims to provide an objective basis for determining the heritage value of individual historic buildings and the need for conservation. We have put in place an internal mechanism for monitoring the demolition of or alterations to declared monuments and proposed monuments, as well as graded historic buildings and the buildings with proposed grading. The Buildings Department, Lands Department and Planning Department will alert the Commissioner for Heritage's office and the AMO when they identify possible threats which may affect privately owned monuments and historic buildings of heritage value that have been brought to the department's attention by way of applications and inquiries received and in their normal course of duty, such as regular inspections. These two officers will then approach the owners of the privately owned historic buildings concerned to explore conservation options. We recognize that on the premise of respecting private property rights, appropriate economic incentives should be offered to encourage the private owners or in exchange for their consent to conserve historic buildings in their ownership. The current economic incentives offered include compensation to private owners for their loss due to conservation of historic buildings. For example, private owners will be given policy support for their applications to relax the restrictions on plot ratio and or site coverage, in order to encourage them to adopt a preservation-development approach in preserving and revitalizing the historic buildings. In response to the AAB's recommendations, we are carefully considering the provision of more attractive economic incentives beyond compensation, according to the heritage value, scale and building conditions of privately owned historic buildings. Other than the related policies, the provision of economic incentives involves public resources and financial commitment. As such, we will conduct in-depth study with reference to the practices overseas so as to ensure the conservation of built heritage and respect for private property rights on the one hand and to strike a balance between financial consideration and public interests on the other. Thank you. Mr. Martin Liao. Now, in part 3 of the main reply, that is the conservation of private buildings of heritage value. Now, so you have to face private owners from past experience. And what have you learned? And my question is, on the government's conservation options and the work of the government, how can it enhance the understanding of owners of such aspects so they won't be so resentful to government's conservation options, and so they will be more prepared to conserve their historic buildings in the light of economic incentives. Secretary, thank you. I think in the process, the most important aspect is promotion and education and enhancing awareness of conservation of heritage. So we are doing a lot in those respects. And as Mr. Liao has pointed out, these historic buildings are in private ownership. If there's to be development, could there be any compromise option? So on the one hand, owners don't suffer loss, but on the other, we could conserve the buildings. Now, we have various forms of economic incentives for owners' consideration. And we will go by the existing approach in discussing with owners and communicating with them. Mr. Abraham Sheck. Thank you. Now, even you offered economic incentives in the past, many private owners did not agree to conserving their historic buildings, so many of the historic buildings have been demolished. Now, the $500 million fund, is it to be used for paying compensation, education, or is it to be spent by the AMO to carry out this work? Secretary, thank you, Mr. Deputy. Mr. Sheck, for your question. The $500 million is not a huge sum. If it's used for paying compensation or buying the historic buildings, it won't be sufficient. As the Antiquities Advisory Board AAB carried out its policy review, it heard a lot of views from the community. On the whole, it will use public funds to compulsorily buy historic buildings, or we use public powers to limit the development of private buildings. Well, there is a contentious issue in the community. The public believe it is important to protect private ownership rights and private development rights as well. So the $500 million would not be used for the purpose. Rather, it would be used for several aspects of our work. One, the revitalization scheme, it will be continued, and then we will also we revitalize certain historic buildings for other uses, and if necessary, we may subsidize the operating costs for the first 2 years. for private historic buildings, even if it's not going to be development, they need to be maintained, so the fund can be used to subsidize maintenance costs. The third aspect is public education and promotion. As we reviewed the policy, we heard from the community this view, that is, we should, through professional bodies or non-profit making bodies, to carry out more community promotion and education. For instance, recently, the Institute of Architects hosted this event. Members of the public were led on a tour of the few historic buildings conserved in Central. And the history of these buildings was explained to the tour members, and everyone was very interested. So we wanted people to better understand about the history of these buildings, and then they will cherish these buildings. And if private owners want as they consider the possibility of the development, maybe they could come up with an option that could both make possible development and conservation. Thank you. Mr. Jeffrey Lam. If the government lists a historic building as monument, is for the purpose of discussing with the owner the various terms and whether the building ought to be conserved. But then often there are differences of opinions. Maybe for the original owners, they may have some memory of that site. They're not willing to go for land exchange. Under the Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance, Section 8, the government could decide on the amount of compensation. Now, many people did not accept that in the past. They thought the government ought to be more flexible. So would you consider some form of an arbitration system? So there could be an independent third party to help in the mediation. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Lam, for the question. It's a good point. Yes, in the past, when we tried to conserve historic buildings, we offered various forms of economic incentives for Grade 1 monuments. We could even go for a land exchange. I'm sure the best-known example must be King Yin Lei. Another well-known example is the one that failed, that is the Ho Tung Gardens. For Ho Tung Gardens, as Mr. Jeffrey Lam pointed out, we announced that the Ho Tung Gardens to be listed monuments, and we had a year to consider various options. But at the end, of course, we failed in our efforts. Eventually, the property was sold for more than $5 billion. It was demolished, so it's quite sad. Under the current legislation, if we declare building as a monument or historic building, even if the owners do not agree, they can't do anything if the government has made the declaration. They can only seek compensation through a court process. And that's a confrontational approach in dealing with the matter is not the best approach. That's why we would like to have discussion, rather, with owners. There is now one Grade 1 historic building, and we are now doing exactly that. We are now discussing with the owners on possible options. Unless it's absolutely necessary, we don't want to go to court on a case like that. Now, can we go for some form of arbitration? Maybe it's not going to help very much. That's why we don't have such plans for the time being. It will still try to do our very best to explore an option that's acceptable to both parties in addressing these cases. Thank you. Mr. Tony Jie. Thank you, Mr. Deputy. Many in the community are concerned about the conservation of historic buildings. In formulating a conservation policy, I hope the government wouldn't just put the emphasis on preservation. I hope you will also attach equal importance to revitalization. Only then can we call it conservation. How do we make the best use of historic buildings? Very often, alterations will be necessary. And of course, then in such alterations, the requirements of the buildings ordinance must be complied with. But the buildings ordinance actually targets mostly new buildings. For historic buildings, it would be difficult for the BO requirements to be met. So would you consider the practices in other countries? So you will formulate a piece of legislation that is for historic buildings. So it won't be too difficult to make alterations, and there won't be so many constraints in making the best use of the building. Secretary. I thank Mr. Tony Che for his question. He's right to point this out. Yes, in conducting the review, many in the professional sectors put forward valuable comments. One point made was about the buildings ordinance requirements and fire services ordinance requirements. You're right. These requirements mostly apply to new buildings, modern buildings. And if you want to apply these requirements to old buildings, there could be many constraints. On the one hand, we may not be able to meet those requirements, and on the other, even if we are able to meet the requirements, maybe the cost would be exorbitant. Now, we attach great importance to this issue. That's why I have asked one of the Deputy Secretary to follow up on the matter. For those involved in the previous successful examples of revitalization and with people from the professional sectors, I'd like our colleagues will sit down together with them to see what we can learn from those experiences. In the first quarter of this year, the Buildings Department will be issuing a practice note on historic buildings. So a guideline could be given to the sectors in dealing with frequently encountered issues, because mostly the concerns are about the structural and the fire service safety. And then there is also a code of practice. And we plan to roll that out in 2 phases. The first phase will be rolled out in the first half of the year. So over the years, we may have encountered problems in conserving historic buildings, and we may have come up with solutions, and how we could adopt a performance-based approach to deal with such cases. So we are going to give concrete examples for reference. Hopefully that could help the sectors concerned. And we'll also see whether there's room for further improvement, and we will certainly make those improvements. Thank you. Mr. Gary Chen. Thank you, Mr. Deputy. Now, for the $500 million fund is for revitalization and subsidizing maintenance, as the Secretary pointed out. But that won't really address the conflicts between development and conservation. Because if you want to further conserve private buildings and sites, then, of course, it involves the question of ownership and property rights. That's why the DAB has suggested a fund. The government could inject funds, and there could also be financing in the private sector, and then we could buy over historic buildings with conservation value. Now, if after you've set up this fund, Secretary, would you consider extending the scope of the fund and also increasing the amount of the fund? So you could also use the fund to buy historic buildings, privately owned historic buildings with conservation value. Secretary? Thank you for the question. As I reply to Mr. Abraham Sheck, for the $500 million, it's a drop in the bucket if it's to be used for buying historic buildings. Given the value of properties in Hong Kong, the $500 million wouldn't get very far. So the fund really is for revitalization, education, and promotion. But if we are to use a fund to buy properties, well, as I said, during the consultation, there were divergent views expressed in the community on this approach. And we're talking about a huge financial commitment either, so unfortunately, we do not have such plans at the moment. Mrs. Regina Ip. Thank you, Mr. Deputy. Secretary, the AAB, my apology. Is there a self-review mechanism under the AAB let's say for the west wing of the government offices, central government offices, originally it was graded 2, and then eventually it suddenly became grade 1. But then that building had no special characteristics. For civil servants who worked there before, in general, they agreed the building should be demolished. Now you are in charge of land policy. You know there is a serious shortage of grade 8 office space. So is there really any value in conserving the west wing of the central government offices as a grade 1 monument? Is there any room for review? Secretary. Thank you, Mrs. Yip, for the question. On the evaluation of the heritage value of buildings, there are 2 levels. One, we have an experts experts panel to give an initial grading on 6 aspects. So that is the historic value, the building value, the composite value, social value, the district value, and also the rarity and the condition of the building and so on. And then when the AAB has these meetings, then it will refer to the advice of the experts panel, and then it will come to a decision. At the moment, there is not a review mechanism on the decisions of the AAB. In the past, cases like Mrs. Yip happened, and then for the Tung-kwok pawn shop, it was to be demolished, and originally it was graded. It was a grade 3 monument, but the members of the public thought the building shouldn't be demolished. It should be graded higher. So the AAB reviewed the relevant information and maintained the grading of the building. But then there is not a review mechanism on the decisions of AAB. Thank you.
Bill's first reading. Securities and Futures Amendment Bill 20.